Long ago, movie cameras were completely manual, and you could crank the film through the camera at any frame rate you wanted. On playback through a projector, all you had to do was match the shooting rate to get the speed right. Or you could run the projector slower for slow motion effects, or faster for great wacky comedy Keystone Cop effects. Today, shooting speeds are standardized, mechanical, and digital, which is more precise and more complex than it was at the beginning of the 20th century. In this segment, we're going to look at overcranking and undercranking the modern video camera for effect. From 1 to 60 to 120 frames per second and higher, we're shooting high speed so we can go slow-mo next on TechKnow. We've all seen early film clips of people comically prancing about at high speeds. To the casual viewer, it might seem like the old films were just shot in unusual speeds back in the old days. But the real problem isn't the original film, however. The problem is that our modern equipment is playing it back at the wrong speed. In the silent film era, a frame rate of 16 frames per second was generally considered to be, more or less, the proper speed. In reality, the rate ranged anywhere from 14 to 24 frames per second. With hand-cranked cameras, the actual frame rate is subject to variation, of course, due to operator fatigue and the number of cups of coffee consumed. The mechanism on most early cameras meant that one full crank advanced 1 or 2 feet of film through the camera, meaning that the film rate was often expressed in terms of feet per minute or cranks per minute instead of frames per second. When a film was distributed to theaters, instruction sheets for the projectionists were included, specifying the duration of a 1,000-foot reel and how long it should take to play. So a reel with a duration of exactly 16 minutes and 36 seconds would move through the camera at 1 foot per second and have a frame rate of 16 frames per second. In practice, silent films were actually played back at wildly varying and often incorrect frame rates. Ultimately, playback speed was up to the theater management and the whims of the projectionist. Let's look at a simplified example of transferring a hypothetically perfect 16 frame per second silent film to a modern 35mm print, which runs at 24 frames per second. Keep in mind that our goal here is to keep the speed of the action in the film as normal and natural as possible. Clearly, some frames of the original film need to be duplicated on the 24 frame per second print. And this is our fundamental problem. We can theoretically shoot at any frame rate we want, but the video needs to be distributed in some standardized format. For television, these standardized formats are strictly defined by the NTSC, the ATSC, or some other official body. Certain modern video cameras can shoot at variable frame rates, typically from 1 to 60 frames per second. If a video camera shoots to a video format that's locked into a physical tape format, such as DV to mini DV tape, then some sort of conversion needs to happen. Just like when we print a 16 frame per second silent film to 24 frame per second 35mm film. Some transfers are easy, like shooting 10 frames per second but recording at 30 frames per second, or shooting 15 frames per second to 30 frames per second. Other situations are more complex, such as when shooting 24 frame per second video to a 30 frame per second format. Keep in mind that what we're talking about here is shooting at different frame rates, but playing back the video so that the action appears normal. This is not the same as undercranking or overcranking for effect. Undercranking would be shooting at a lower frame rate and playing back at a higher rate, like our old silent film. Overcranking is more common and is useful for dramatic slow motion effects. With an old film camera, that might mean turning the handle twice as fast to 30 frames a second so that when it's played back at 15 frames per second in the theater, you get a cool slow motion effect. As we hinted at before, some cameras can overcrank, but many cannot. For example, it simply isn't possible to overcrank a DV camcorder to 60 frames per second and squeeze those frames onto mini DV tape, which is a strictly defined format. It is possible to use your software to slow NTSC 60i interlaced footage by 50% at the cost of half your resolution by splitting individual fields out to frames. The effect actually looks pretty good, really, even at half resolution. While most software applications will let you slow things down even further, you're going to end up duplicating frames or fields to do so. Or your editor might go one step further and actually generate in-between frames with a little crossfade effect of sorts. It might work, but practically speaking, 50% is the slowest you should generally go with interlaced footage. There are spendy software applications that will do a little more when interpolating in between frames, but a better situation would be if you could really overcrank the frame rate and shoot more frames per second. To do this, you need to free the camera from a rigidly defined video format with a defined frame rate, and this means freeing the camera from the physically restricted speed of videotape running past the recording head. Overcranking and undercranking to solid-state memory cards or hard disk lets some cameras shoot at frame rates from 1 to 60 or even 120 frames per second. For example, the Panasonic HVX200 can be overcranked to 60 frames per second as long as the camera is recording to memory card and not to DV tape. Some Sony consumer models can be overcranked to 120 frames per second at reduced resolutions by recording 3 seconds of video to an internal memory buffer. The buffer is then dumped to tape, hard disk, or memory card. Even more exotic and expensive solutions might let you shoot at 1,000 frames per second directly to a high-speed disk array in a computer. But this is some pretty advanced and specialized technology. As camcorders enter the post-tape era, we should expect to see a lot more creative flexibility in terms of format and frame rate, just like we had 100 years ago with the very first motion picture cameras.